Mayhem at an early morning market. China condemns what it's calling a serious violent terrorist incident. It's blamed previous attacks in Xinjiang province on separatists. But what's driving the unrest? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Mike Hanna. Welcome to the program. An attack at a busy market in China's far west has left dozens dead, with the blame being laid at the door of a separatist movement in the troubled Xinjiang province. Two vehicles were crashed into an early morning market, with bombs thrown into the crowd. The region is home to ethnic Uighur Muslims who've been complaining of an erosion of their culture and religious freedoms. Adrian Brown has more details now from Beijing.
It is the worst act of violence in the troubled region of Xinjiang in years. Two SUVs were driven into a busy morning market in Urumqi as the assailants threw explosives. They then crashed head-on, with one vehicle exploding. Witnesses said there were at least 12 blasts. It's not yet known who's responsible, but recent violence in the region has been blamed on Uyghur separatists.
This violent incident lays bare the anti-human, anti-social and anti-civilization nature of the terrorists and deserves the condemnation of both the international community and the Chinese people. The Chinese government is confident and capable of cracking down on violent terrorists. Their plots will never succeed.
Thursday's attack took place a few weeks after a bombing at Urumqi's train station that killed 3 people and injured 79. The city had been relatively quiet since mass riots in 2009 killed almost 200 people. Ethnic tensions between the native Uyghur community and the majority Han Chinese have existed for years. Observers say the recent violence, including a suicide attack near the gates of the Forbidden City in Beijing, show the separatists are beginning to target civilians and not just police and government officials. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
So there's plenty to discuss then. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Alam Saitoff, spokesman for the World Uyghur Congress. In Beijing, we have Shay Tao, a political science professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University. And also in Washington, D.C. is Sophie Richardson, China Director for Human Rights Watch. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Shay Tao in Beijing. Who does the Chinese government hold responsible for this attack?
Well, I think the Chinese government make it very clear that they hold the separatist groups, the Uyghurs, responsible, even though at this moment no separatist group has stand out to claim responsibility for this attack or any previous attacks.
Well, Alam Saitoff, your view, who do you think is responsible for this attack?
We're not sure at the moment. It's too early to tell who was responsible for the attack. Again, no claim of responsibility by any individual or any group. But of course, anytime something like this happens, the Chinese government is quick to blame the Uyghurs and call it a premeditated terrorist attack, and use it as a pretext to justify its heavy-handed repression of the Uyghur people.
Well, Sophie Richardson, there we have once again the Chinese government position repeatedly, as was mentioned, blaming the Uyghurs for such attacks. Your view of the Chinese government's position in this, is it just seeking scapegoats every time?
Well, first, I think the most important point to emphasize right at the moment is the response to the attack, which has to involve credible and transparent investigations, respect for due process, access to legal counsel, and the Chinese government refraining from excessive use of force or engaging in mass sweeps of people in Urumqi, as we've seen it do in the past. As the other guests have said, nobody's claimed responsibility. There is a sort of blanket suggestion or implication that Uyghurs are responsible for this attack, but this is a very common refrain from the Chinese government, and it's used so often that it's now not a terribly credible explanation or attribution of blame.
Well, Professor Shea, does the Chinese government see this, regardless of who's specifically responsible, as part of essentially a separatist campaign being waged in that area?
I believe so. In fact, I kind of disagree with what the two guests just said. Well, it's not the frame from the Chinese government, the refrain, sorry. The Chinese government made many investigations before, for example, the past two terrorist attacks. And so there is sufficient evidence to show that there is a close link between these terrorist bombs and some separatist groups based in Xinjiang. And these separatist groups, most of them are from Uyghur people. So when you, like one of the guests said, the Chinese government need not use excessive force, has to give people access to due process of law. All this sounds perfectly fine. But remember, when you are in such a situation, when there's such a domestic outrage against indiscriminate violence against civilians and innocent people, there is such a strong public pressure on the Chinese leaders. Remember, Americans did the same thing, and something that even probably more stupid than many other people. Look at Guantanamo Bay. Look at U.S. invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think that at this moment, it's not the moment to talk to the Chinese government. Calm down and use due process of law. And that will definitely even more enrage the Chinese public opinion.
Well, Alam Saitov, your response to that?
My response is, I think Professor Shi is towing the Chinese government blind, basically stating that the government seems to have provided sufficient and substantive evidence to prove that the acts of certain acts were indeed terrorism, such as the Tiananmen or later the Kunming attacks. When you look at this, the Chinese government response, especially the media report by Xinhua, it's always boilerplate. So I blame the Uyghurs, say premeditated terrorist attack with very little evidence and information later on. Then we were not exactly sure what happened, exactly who did it, and even though the Chinese government claimed somebody did it, then later on we do not know what happened to those individuals. And the Chinese government response, of course, it is under tremendous Chinese government people's pressure to act quickly to resolve the case. But as we have seen in the Urumqi bombing, as soon as Xi Jinping left Urumqi, at the train station bombing, right after that the Chinese government arrested more than 100 of the relatives of the bomber, his wife, his kids, his parents, his grandparents, as well as his mother and father-in-laws and all the relatives. This is a kind of response usually the Uyghur people get in any kind of political violence situation. But if the violence was carried out by the Han Chinese, in many cases, immediately that's termed as something antisocial activity, or the perpetrator is considered as insane or lost his mind or mental, then they just never call it a terrorist attack. We have witnessed a number of Chinese attacks, bomb attacks, killing of innocent Chinese, like in Xiamen on a bus, more than 40 Chinese were killed. But we have never witnessed the Chinese government or the people calling these attacks as terrorist attacks. Clearly, you see a double standard. If it's conducted by Uyghurs or so-called ethnic minorities like Tibetans, these were labeled as terrorist activities. But when the Han Chinese, whether they kill 1, 10, or 100, it's always something else.
Well, Sophie Richardson, I'll come to you in a moment, but I just want to go to Shay Tal first of all. Yes, I'd like your response to that's the accusation that double standards are being practiced.
Well, I would like to point out, what, my colleague mentioned about, Chinese, Han Chinese also commit violence against the Chinese. Yes, he mentioned like what happened in Kunming, in Changsha, in Xiamen and other cities. And I believe the Chinese government used the same language too. That's terrorist violence. It's indiscriminate violence against innocent people. Now, my question is that based on what my colleague just said, I want to ask a question. As somebody who is a spokesperson for the World Uyghur Organization, I understand your position, and I was in Washington, D.C. actually last week. And so, do you support or oppose such kind of violence against innocent civilians?
Alam Saitov, your response.
Thank you. It's a very important question. First of all, it's easy to ask a question like this. And when you look at the big picture, China, first of all, is an authoritarian one-party dictatorship.
Will you just answer the question first of all, Alan Saitov? Would you answer the question directly put?
The question is, again, sorry, I was just talking on another point.
Shaital, what was the
Well,
specific
whether I-
question?
Do you support or
Yes.
Okay, let me repeat my question. Okay.
Okay.
Do you support or oppose
Okay, whether I
any
support-
kind of violence like this, indiscriminate violence?
We obviously do not support any kind of violence that targets civilians, whether it's carried out by an individual, by a group, or by a state like the Chinese government.
Yeah.
And the Chinese government always carries out such
I agree.
state violence and the terrorism against Uyghurs. Just on Tuesday, we have learned that the Chinese security forces killed a dozen Uyghurs, unarmed Uyghur civilians, for protesting against the ban on the headscarves and the growing beards. When the Chinese state kills innocent Uyghurs, we never see any Han Chinese like you, Mr. Shitao, condemn such acts of violence by the Chinese state against innocent civilians. The double standard is every time something like this happens,
let me correct
when
one point,
unfortunately Uyghurs attack the Han, you just accuse the Uyghurs of somehow like supporting some attack on some innocent Han Chinese. Whether it's Chinese or Uyghurs attacked by
you see, I am
whoever,
not speaking on behalf
it
of
is
the
not
Chinese
correct.
government.
Right.
Do you support the Chinese government attack and the killing innocent Uyghurs?
Could I speak for 1 minute?
Yes, indeed.
Yes,
Shaital.
answer the question.
Okay. Can I just very briefly, okay. Remember, you have to understand that when you look at the Chinese social media today, like Chinese media reports, there are clearly divisions within the Chinese public about what happened and how the Chinese government should respond to violence in Xinjiang. So when you said, like, Han people like me, I would always assume that any terrorist attack was committed by Uyghur people. No. You look at a couple of pictures after the Kunming train station accident. Many Han Chinese are saying this is very unfortunate that many people, they are Uyghurs, but simply because they look like Uyghurs and they carry Xinjiang ID cards, so they are denied access to hotels, to airports, and many Han Chinese denounce such kind of a government policy from Beijing. And there are people who disagree with what the Chinese government does. And you have to really understand that the Han Chinese is not a monolithic group, that they are totally hateful of Uyghur people. No, that's totally wrong.
Well, let's go to Sophie Richardson. Finally, apologies for leaving you out there while this discussion was going on. But this discussion does show something very important. As with previous incidents, the debate tends to be about who did it and the Chinese government response rather than the act itself. And what we've been seeing is actions that have been going beyond the actual region itself, the Xinjiang region, and you have seen attacks in other parts of China and attacks also pointedly at civilians. This, of course, a great cause for concern, is it not?
Yeah, a couple of very quick points. First of all, violence against civilians is completely unacceptable in any context, and international law is unambiguous on this subject. I do want to come back to the point about access to legal redress, though, because this is a problem that we have documented in great detail across China, but particularly in Xinjiang. For example, in the wake of the July 2009 unrest in Urumqi, we documented the disappearance, meaning the apprehension by state agents of Uyghur men and boys whose families couldn't get any information about whether and where they were being held. And that's a violation of domestic and international law. We've continued to document problems like that. But on the larger point, we too find it very disturbing to see an increase in violence, whether it's involving ethnic minority issues, whether it's other kinds of problems about forced evictions or land expropriation. You know, this is a country that has remained relatively free of those kinds of problems for several decades now, and it's of real concern to us, regardless of which ethnic community we're talking about, to see these kinds of problems. And we believe that the solution lies in transparent investigations that guarantee people access to due process.
Well, let's just pause here and take a look at the wider picture. The Xinjiang region has had an intermittent history of autonomy and short-lived independence, officially becoming part of Communist China in 1949. It's the largest of China's administrative regions and home to more than 50 ethnic minorities. The regional capital is Urumqi, where the latest attack took place. Uyghurs, who are ethnically Turkic Muslims, were once the majority in what they consider their traditional homeland. They now make up around 45% of Xinjiang's population. Many blame the influx of China's Han majority for undermining their commercial, cultural and religious activities. Beijing, though, says it's invested heavily in the region and blames separatist groups for waging a violent campaign in Xinjiang and beyond its borders. The latest attack in Xinjiang happened a day after the mass trial of 39 people on terrorism charges. A court in Urumqi handed down sentences of up to 15 years. Charges included inciting violence, organizing and taking part in terrorist activities, illegally making firearms, and promoting ethnic hatred. All suspects were reported to have ethnic Uyghur names. Now, Alam Saitov, on the issue of that trial, do you think there could be any connection in terms of the timing? Was the fact that this attack took place the day after sentences handing down a coincidence?
I'm not sure about the timing. Maybe it's a coincidence. But we have seen increasing arrest, imprisonment, and sentencing of Uyghurs because of their online activism and activities. And we have seen after the massacre of Uyghurs on July the 5th of 2009, Uyghur writers, historians, bloggers, webmasters were arrested and sentenced to 15 and more years. And that's why the Chinese government intends to silence the voice of the Uyghurs. And this is nothing new because the Chinese government is really afraid that the Uyghur people will be able to expose China's colonial rule in East Turkestan by using internet and their mobile phones. That's why the lesson is by arresting and sentencing 39 Uyghurs just yesterday to send a strong message to the Uyghur people that if you expose the Chinese government's colonial and repressive policies in East Turkestan, if you share anything that's sensitive or considered as anti-Chinese government, then we'll lock you up and throw away the key. So the message is loud and clear. So Uyghurs, you have to keep quiet. You have two choices: either accept Chinese rule and be assimilated and become a Chinese, or if you raise your head, just like Chinese President Xi Jinping said during his visit, if you raise your head, we'll preemptively strike and kill and attack, then just simply call you three evil forces. And because the West now has this kind of Islamic phobia, which is beneficial for the Chinese, so it is easy for the Chinese government to label the Uyghurs as terrorists, separatists, and religious extremists.
Well, if I may go to Shay Tal, though, on that particular thing, there you're hearing the argument that the trial, which has just been concluded, is further evidence that there is discrimination against the Uyghur people. Your response to that claim?
Well, I'm not familiar with the facts of the case that you mentioned. And what I would like to say that instead of trading accusations here with my colleague, and whom I respect, because of his opinion, I would say make 2 points, kind of like my closing argument. One, the Chinese government does need to reassess its own ethnic policies. There's a growing consensus among Chinese scholars and Chinese policymakers that our ethnic policy has been going wrong in some areas, in Xinjiang in particular. And so that's my first point. Second, I think any such kind of violence cannot be tolerated or accepted. And so it's either it's against the Han Chinese or against the Uyghurs. Nobody in China or I think in the world would condone such kind of violence. But in the end, if you look back at, let's say, the Hamas movement, look at IRA, look at ETA in Spain, in the end, any such kind of separatist movement would have to come back to the table for political solution. And that's what I would propose, that we all have to work together for political solution instead of killing innocent Chinese or Uyghur people.
Well, Sophie Richardson there mentioned that the Chinese government needs to review its ethnic policies. What's your view?
Well, look, I think in principle, the points that Professor Xie just made are pretty non-controversial. But it's hard to imagine at the moment how a discussion between these communities even begins on equal footing or with confidence on either side. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the case of Ilham Tohti, who's a very prominent Uyghur economist who has publicly articulated an anti-separatist view. He's not advocated for independence. He's been peacefully critical of the Chinese government. He's a very important figure because he served as a bridge between the two communities. And so it's been of real concern that he has been detained and is likely going to be charged with inciting separatism. The evidence of this is completely unclear. He has no access to counsel or family. And so not only does that raise those considerations about due process, but I think it also raises real concerns about when one of the kinds of people who's precisely best equipped to engage in the kind of discussion I think Professor Xie is envisioning about how to rectify some of these policies that many people now believe to have gone wrong, how both sides of the equation engage in a discussion like that with real confidence.
Well, Alam Setoff, your view, is there a possibility of a conversation, of discussion, of a meeting of the minds in an attempt to end this ongoing violence?
Absolutely, that's what the World Uyghur Congress has been calling for peaceful dialogue to resettle the political status of East Turkestan with the Chinese government. But our calling has fallen on deaf ears in Beijing. Instead of finding a genuine political solution that's acceptable to both sides, the Chinese government's policy towards the Uyghur people has been, just like in Tibet and Inner Mongolia, it is since 1949 to today, 65 years, it is repression, repression, and repression. The harder it's just a hit again and again. As we listened this morning from Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang, it is to step up even more to crack down even harder on the Uyghurs. But we see the harder the Chinese government repress the Uyghur people, we see the stronger the resistance. Now we are witnessing a new kind of political violence carried out by the Uyghurs and sometimes probably by the Han even Tibetans. But the solution really lies within the hands of the Chinese government. China should seek a peaceful solution by discussing the Uyghur issue and the Tibetan issue and the Inner Mongolian issue, by settling this issue, the political issues, by genuinely granting what they are seeking.
Political solution.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the Chinese government, instead of negotiating with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as promised, instead of finding a political solution with the Uyghur people, it is just a head-on collision with the Uyghur people. Kill, attack, kill, blame the Uyghurs, then deceive the Chinese people with Chinese government
let's
propaganda.
go to Shay Tao on that particular point, as we're running out of time. Apologies, Alim. However, rather than broadening it out, let's keep it focused in on the issue of the Uyghurs. Is there the propensity or the possibility within the Chinese administration to seek a political solution to the issue of the Xinjiang region?
Okay. So again, there's a precondition, there's a premise for any political discussion or solution to the ongoing violence. And my colleague just mentioned, that is, there's no way that the Chinese government or the Chinese public would accept an independent so-called Eastern Turkestan. And I think my colleague understands this. This is a bottom line. This is a red line over which the Chinese government would never concede anything at all. And so if you are talking about like an independent Eastern Turkestan, I think there would be no point of any political discussion. I think that's the Chinese government's stance on this.
Well, let's go to Sophie Richardson very quickly. Is there the possibility of negotiation?
Well, look, I think we would be in a very different situation if the Chinese authorities were actually upholding and guaranteeing the rights that are written in the books for Uyghurs. If there was room for real respect for cultural practices, for language, for more of a stake in what kinds of economic development is being pursued, to not raise the city of Kashgar. I mean, many of the solutions are already there on paper. The problem is that they're not respected in reality. And I think that's the logical place to start, by upholding the guarantees that actually exist.
Well, unfortunately, that is the logical place to stop this discussion. My thanks to our guests, Alam Setoff, Shay Tao, and Sophie Richardson. And do let us know your thoughts. You can find us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or send your comments to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.